And it was there that Dad was ready to come out of the U.S. Army. But his immediate commander over the malaria control unit knew that your father enjoyed his time in Liberia. And it was because of your father and another individual who became a doctor out in Washington, D.C. I think his name was Poindexter. They had written this paper, this research paper, that allowed the commander of the malaria control unit to advance. And, and it was a paper that was very significant to the U.S. war effort altogether. Your dad, your dad's initial uh, interaction, educational interaction, was not in the area of pre-medicine. When he came to Minnesota to work on his graduate degree, because his father wanted him to go back to school because he graduated from Wiley College at 19 years old. And his dad saw his brilliance as well and told him, you know, our grandfather, Thomas H. Johnson Sr., told your father, Thomas H. Johnson Jr., I want you to go back to school. You have a brilliant mind. You graduated at 19 years old. And he wanted to kind of debate his father. He said, well, I'm making more money than you are. And plus, there's nowhere else I can go to school in Texas because it was segregated. But Texas would pay your room and board to find a school outside of the state of Texas. And so he had never traveled really outside of the state of Texas other than to Arizona, where they pick cotton and peas and whatever other types of vegetables and so forth to make money, to work his way back to Texas to buy clothes, fancy clothes. And so he had never been to the North. And so he went to his mother's brother, who had traveled in all 48 states of the United States at that time. And he asked him, he said, well, you know, my dad wants me to go back to school. He said, but I don't know where to go. And his uncle had been a bootlegger during Prohibition. And they would travel to Minnesota because Minnesota was one of the key areas to get legal whiskey from Canada. But when it came into the United States, it was illegal. But that's where they would get it. That was one of the locations that they would get it during Prohibition, during the years of the decade of Prohibition, and truck it back to Texas. So he told your father back then, he said, one of the finest states that I've been in and cities that I've been in has been Minneapolis, St. Paul. Why don't you try the university up there? And that's how your dad came to Minnesota, with a one-way ticket, where he got off the train in St. Paul and with his suitcase walked all the way to the Phyllis Wheatley Settlement House in North Minneapolis. So that was his journey from Texas to begin with. So anyway, when he came to Minnesota, his graduate work was in zoology. And so while he was in the military in Liberia, he enjoyed being out in the swamp, in the jungle, whatever, in the forest, gathering mosquito larvae, snakes, other types of reptiles and so forth. That was his thing. He liked that. And so he and another fellow had gathered mosquito larvae, and they took it back to the laboratory and began to do their research. And out of their research came a paper in which they articulated which Anopheles mosquito carried the malaria virus. The United States and the British had the desire in most instances, particularly in the war theaters in Asia, to garrison on the high ground. And the Japanese would bivouac in the swamps. And so they assumed that being on the high ground, they were not susceptible to the malaria. Whereas the Japanese apparently had already understood that the mosquito in the swamp was not the one that carried the virus of malaria. And that is what your father and this other gentleman, Poindexter, proved in 1943 based on their research in Liberia. And they gave that to their commander, who was Captain West at the time. And Captain West was able to deliver that to the United States Defense Department and so forth. And that brought about certain changes once they realized that it was the mosquito on the high ground, dry ground, that was carrying malaria.